Being open-minded and having an open mind towards happy accidents can create something that pushes the boundaries, and creates something really unique.
Sound is the unsung hero of interaction design. That iconic chorus you hear as you boot up your Mac, the double knock of an arriving Slack message, and the ascending notes Airpods make when they connect to a device all provide context and feedback without visual interactions. Without sound in our design toolbox, interacting with technology would be a much more cumbersome experience.
Connor Moore has helped companies like Tesla, Uber, Peloton, and YouTube shape their brand and enhance the user experience through sound design. We spoke with Connor about how he found his career, his creative process, and the tools he uses, and how sound shapes a brand experience. This is Design Better, where we explore creativity at the intersection of design and technology. I'm Eli Woolery.
And I'm Aaron Walter. You can get ad-free episodes, bonus content, discounted workshops, access to our library of books, and to our monthly AMAs with big names in design and tech by becoming a Design Better Premium subscriber. It's also the best way to support the show. Visit designbetterpodcast.com/subscribe to learn more. We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. Eli and I are super pumped to be joining our friends at User Testing at the Human Insight Summit in Austin, Texas this October, the 28th through the 30th. It's an event that will help you learn how to bring customer insights closer to the product design process. And I got to tell you, the speaker lineup is inspiring. And Eli and I will be recording a live episode of Design Better on stage with User Testing CEO Andy McMillan. 500 builders and creators will be there from some of the largest and most innovative brands in the world for a 3-day event focused on transforming the way products and experiences are built. You're going to make so many great connections there while honing your skills. And it's Austin, one of our favorite cities in the world. So right now, snag your ticket at usertesting.com/designbetter and use the code DesignBetter50 and you'll get half off your ticket. That's 50% off of your admission. Eli and I would love to meet you in person in Austin. Come see us and come meet us at the Human Insight Summit in Austin, Texas. We can't wait to see you there. Visit usertesting.com/designbetter and use code DesignBetter50 for half off your ticket. Few things frustrate designers quite as much as seeing the UI that they've been meticulously designing botched when it's built out. But Zeppelin can help you make every design to dev handoff efficient and accurate so you can nail every release on time and on budget. Zeppelin documents your design system, user journeys, design specs, and code snippets so your developers know exactly what to build and everyone has a shared understanding of your product. And Zeppelin integrates with your entire tool stack, including Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD, Jira, and Storybook. Plus, Zeppelin has a new plan where you can get unlimited seats for one flat rate for just $15 a month. Other tools are charging $15 or more per developer seat. With Zeppelin, you get unlimited seats for just $15. That means you can invite your entire team or freelance clients without worrying about being hit with a big unexpected bill. Design Better listeners can get their first month of the basic plan for free with code DESIGNBETTER. All caps, just one word, Design Better. Just go to zeppelin.io and use code DESIGNBETTER to get your first month of the basic plan for free. That's zeppelin.io, zeppelin.io, and use the code DESIGNBETTER. Build better workflows and collaborative relationships between design and development with Zeppelin. And now, back to the show.
Connor Moore, welcome to the Design Better podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Love what you're doing here. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're really excited to talk to you. This is our first interview with a sound designer. So, right off the bat, you were curious, how did you find a career in sound design? It looks like you worked at a few interesting places, Uber, Tesla, public radio, KQED, our local Bay Area public radio. What got you into this career?
I mean, it kind of goes back, like starting up, I grew up in a super musical family. Music was a big part of our experience growing up. My dad was a big guitar player. We were immersed in the greats of jazz music, but also the likes of J.J. Cale and Leon Russell. And that type of stuff was just a big part of our childhood growing up. And my dad, actually, he's a doctor and then opened up a bunch of clinics in Oklahoma. So he was kind of had the business side and obviously in the medical profession, but he always kept that as part of his identity. And still to this day, he's 80 years old, is playing in multiple bands, which, really transferred over to particularly myself and my brothers were all instrumentalists. So yeah, it was just kind of transferred very organically, but my family's also just highly creative. Like my sister is a jeweler. Both my brothers are creative directors at larger companies, and had their own branding firms back in the day. As far as how I got my start playing in bands, just being curious about music and sound, DJing, collecting records. I hosted radio shows back in college, various kind of genre specific radio shows. So I was just from the beginning immersed and then took that curiosity and immersion and just kind of expanded upon it. And I got into, recording my own music in college and really went down the rabbit hole on that. As a multi-instrumentalist, I just was like blown away. You could do it all yourself, record your own drums, your bass, guitar, keys, all that stuff. And then went out to school in San Francisco. That was more of a production focused school for sound design and music composition theory, but mainly production side, learning the tools of the trade. And during that time, really kind of fell into the design community in San Francisco, which at the time, a lot of it is kind of serendipity. As I look back on it now, I was kind of handing out my music, for licensing to agencies at the time or doing custom composition for them. And a few of them were like, hey, have you ever done product sound design? And at the time, I hadn't really considered that, but had a couple early opportunities that really opened my mind, back in 2009, that really opened my mind to how sound could be used for brands on a larger scale outside of just music. And those opportunities, a lot of those folks at the agencies went to brands, right? Went to Google, went to Amazon. And it was at the time, the massive tech boom happening. So there's just a ton of opportunity coming my way and kind of became a go-to person for particularly UX sound design for products and technology and emerging technology. So a lot of it was, getting the tools of the trade, but also being in the right place at the right time.
Connor, what college radio station did you DJ at?
I went to University of Kansas, so it was KJHK.
Nice.
But it was cool. I had a Friday night funk program. I did a jazz program in the mornings sometimes. And then one year I did it was called Breakfast for Beat Lovers. And it was like 9 to noon. And it was all just kind of electronic music, but beat, hip hop, various kind of beat driven music. So that was fun. A very formative experience for me, for sure.
Yeah, my brother was a DJ at Cal Poly, and he was preceded by Weird Al Yankovic, actually.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So good.
It's funny. I actually helped him a few times, and he also did a hip-hop thing. But what was sort of funny was his was a little bit later in the evening, and then his show would transition to a classical music show. And this one time we pulled a little prank where we pulled in a track from this audio comedy group named Firesign Theater. And it played this, was supposedly a classical clip, but it kind of went off on this weird tangent. And we got all these call-ins from like older folks saying, what's going on with this classical
That's
music?
awesome.
So, Connor, maybe you could tell us a little bit, along the way. It sounds like you worked at Tesla. And I'm curious because we've had a Tesla for a little while and our kids love all the sounds. And not surprisingly, given the sometimes juvenile nature of the leader of the company, there's the things like the fart sounds and things like that. But I'm curious what aspects that you worked on when you were
Did you design the
Tesla.
fart sounds, Connor?
Yes, that's what we're really trying to
I wish I could claim that, but that was not me. In full transparency, I actually was not with those companies. I was working with my company as a contractor with them. Some of them are long-term partnerships that are quite expansive, and some of them are very kind of quick, turn 3-6 month engagements on a particular project. But with Tesla, it was actually not designing the sounds you hear in the cars today. The work that I did with them is future facing. So it's actually taking the existing design language they have, which was developed by an engineer who's become a friend of mine, this guy Greg, who, really came at the sound design for Tesla from an engineering side. The very neutral, very simplistic, but very communicative, and they're rooted in music theory. They make sense. But my job was to come in and rethink that in a future-facing way, taking that DNA that they have within them, those kind of rounded sine waves, very simplistic and minimal in nature, and elevating that, right? Pushing them a level forward to where it's like, okay, yes, those are great for today, but like, what do these sound like for the future? And that doesn't necessarily mean futuristic, but it's like just taking it a little bit of a step farther, a little push farther in terms of how the sounds are layered or how they're more dynamic. So those have not been released yet, but hopefully to come soon. If you see it on my website, it's, waiting for release.
That's fun. Connor, maybe we could zoom out for the totally uninitiated. I think, all of us have a phone, and pretty much any app that we use has some element of sound in it. And to some degree, sound really entered the web with Flash, and Flash kind of sunset many years ago. And then the App Store and iOS brought sound into the user experience. But could you just talk to us a little bit about the role that sound plays in shaping a user experience, shaping behavior, the emotional feel of a user experience?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, you mentioned emotional feel. That is one key component of what sound can do. It can kind of reinforce brand. It can develop personality, or support a persona. So that's one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is functionality, communicating to users, right? So we use psychoacoustic principles, basic music theory principles to be communicative, something that all users can kind of understand, ascending melodies for something that's starting or opening up, right? Descending melodies for something that's shutting down or closing. Those are kind of ideas and tools that we use to communicate to users. But the range of work that this kind of touches is everything, like you mentioned, mobile devices, ringtones, alarms, automotive space, alerts in car, that are really communicating to a user what is happening in the moment and how you should respond. Robotics is a big space that I've been working in too, where social robots or delivery robots and how those communicate to people, how they can maybe humanize emerging technology too, right? Some of this technology is very forward thinking and people have never seen it or interacted with it before. So it can be an opportunity to humanize an experience. Coming back, it really is all about that spectrum of creating emotion, personality, or supporting brand. And on the other side being function, right? And like, how can we be very communicative? How can we boost accessibility to a range of users? Because I see sound as a tool in the multimodal toolkit, visuals, haptics, sound, and those should all be used sometimes together, sometimes separately to really be able to boost that accessible experience and make things more intuitive and more informative for users.
Could you maybe share a few specific examples of what you're describing? So you talked about ascending, descending, and some of those principles that guide the type of sound that you might create. What are some specific examples maybe that people might be familiar with, or maybe examples from the work that you've been doing?
A couple things come to mind. Number one, the work that I did with Uber, it's particularly on the driver side of the app. When a request comes in, for example, the sound palette itself is consistent across the entire app experience, right? So it has that kind of connected DNA throughout. We shipped roughly 15 sounds for that app. And that has a consistent tone throughout, which is kind of supporting the brand. But for something, when a request comes in to drivers, it's this ascending melody that kind of prompts them. I think it's like 4 or 5 notes, but it repeats kind of like a ringtone, but it's very positive. It's very uplifting. It's opening, right? Versus something that is, if it's shutting down, might trigger them to have a more negative emotion towards it. So the goal was to keep drivers engaged, be informative to them, but also be connected to the brand. That's one example. Another is I've done a ton of work with Peloton over the last 3 years, and we did some accessibility design on particularly their tread. And this is a really interesting project because we got to work with low vision users during that design process. So in particular, I don't know if you guys have used the tread, but it has two wheels, one on the right, one on the left, that are dedicated to speed and incline. So you can, push it up to push your speed up or push the incline up to boost your incline. But for low vision users, they would often get confused or forget which wheel is which wheel. So tying timbre to each different wheel, there's a kind of holistic key signature throughout the entire user experience across all their products, which is consistent across this. But we wanted to tweak the timbre of that instrumentation to where it's more noticeable for low vision users. So on the right hand, we did this kind of glacier timbre that has a bit more of a tack, like a spin wheel, like tick, 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 that type of feel. Whereas on the left side, it's more of a rounded, warmer kind of sine wave, right? So you can really hear the difference when you're using it, but over time, it becomes learned behavior too. So we found that during that testing process, these low vision users started to use it for, I think it was 5 days or so. And they came back with like, oh yeah, super helpful in terms of just kind of, understanding the intent, as it's going up, the pitch increases as it's going up, as it's going down, the pitch decreases, right? So it's a learned behavior over time for them, but it's been super helpful for that particular demographic.
That's so cool. What's the key signature? I'm just curious. Peloton.
I think it's E major, I believe. I'd have to look. I'd have to get into a session and look.
Connor, you said that, it's important that sound remains consistent across app or a platform. And I'm curious, does it ever make it into, say, a design system for an organization, and how would that be implemented?
Yeah, totally. I mean, part of our process is having intent up front and setting particular key signatures or related key signatures that harmonize with one another to where it is connected and it doesn't bring dissonance into the experience. So we set that early. We try to set that very early so you're not composing in all these different key signatures and then you get a bunch of different sounds in the end that don't relate to one another. And how it's, obviously implementing the files themselves, it becomes ingrained within the design system. But we also do guidelines, to where we lay out specifically what those things are. What are the instruments we use? Why do we use them? How does it relate to the brand? And how does it express the brand values? But also like key signatures and harmony, and really kind of, having that there as a tool they can use if they want to further develop that sound ecosystem. They have the tools to kind of build upon it.
Curious about what tools you use while you're creating these sounds, and both on the digital side, but are there also, looking at you, so for folks who can't see, you've got some instruments behind you, you've got a keyboard, guitars, also looks like an Eames chair. So nod to a prior episode where we interviewed the granddaughter of Charles and Ray Eames. So I'm just curious, like, does it ever, like a Foley artist, you hang up a side of beef and hit it with a baseball bat, or, any crazy like inspiration that you take from the physical world?
Yeah, it's all of the above. I mean, it's the instruments you see behind me. It's found sound, going out into the field and recording those sounds. And that's where you get something really unique, is when you go out, you record unique sounds, you layer them with the instruments that you have, you process them, and then you bring it into your digital audio workstation, and then you start working with different synthesizers and pull it into synthesis and start tweaking things. So it's all of the above. And sometimes, it's project specific, like whatever the project calls for. It could be just found sounds, or it could be just in the box digital kind of soundscapes. But I think where you find the most unique results is when you're doing a combination of all of those things.
Let's talk about sound as branding, because it can give us this feedback, orient us, but it can also play a role in branding. And that was something that I didn't know until many moons ago. I took a group of my students to Germany on a study abroad trip, and we went to the design agency Meta. We would call it Meta. They say Meta. And they shared some examples of the work that they had done, and they worked on T-Mobile. And T-Mobile's logo, it's got a dot, and then there's a T, and then there's, 3 more kind of dots or rectangles. And they pointed out that the do-do-do-do-do, that sound, the little jingle of T-Mobile,
It follows
the logo of the brand. Blew my mind.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about sound as brand, how do you think about that? Where do you start? And what are the elements of creating that?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And there's so many ways to do it in little tricks. You know what I mean? Like we were just talking about with Peloton, what's the key signature? Sometimes Google, for example, uses G major. Their brand name starts with G. I wouldn't say that is audio branding, but it is like, it's a trick within the toolkit that you can kind of play with, and the T-Mobile audio logo is similar, playing off of motion, playing off of visuals and creative ways that tie into that motion or the brand name or the brand ethos, whatever it may be. Those are things you can certainly tap into that give you more depth to your story, which is really interesting. But audio branding as a whole, the way I look at it is it's all about supporting the brand persona or brand values. So big part of what I do is initial stages, getting in with companies, really understanding kind of who the brand is, what they're trying to express, how do they express themselves visually, verbally, what's the intent behind that, and how can we support that sonically. So that initial kind of discovery phase is about learning those things, but also putting them through sound workshops, to where we can sit down and say, okay, we understand, here are your values, here's how you express yourself at these other, for the brand all up. Here's how we think these could come alive musically or sonically, and get sound in front of them early to where they can react and say, oh yeah, that's great, or this is way off. So that kind of gives us a leapfrog into design to where we've already listened to material, clients are already reacting to it. And then we can really comfortably step into the design process, which is highly iterative. Don't need to go too deep into process, but it's just like any design process where the first round we go really wide in terms of concepts, and then it just narrows over time. But as far as audio branding is concerned, it's like it is a massive breadth of work that can be done. It relates to sound logos, product sounds, music, how is music used, across advertising, social channels, et cetera. Experiential, how do these companies show up at their conferences or different kind of larger scale events? How are assets implemented in a connected way, in a cohesive way? If you have a sound logo, creating brand music that infuses maybe that instrumentation or ideas from the core melody of a sound logo into music, that could be used for walk-on or advertising. Those are things that create that connected system. And then when you talk about product sound design or UX sound design, what is that overall sonic palette and how can that apply to product? Product generally should be pretty simple and tends to be more functional, but there's a huge opportunity, as we spoke about earlier, to really bolster a personality or a brand or, an emotion. But at the end of the day, these things, if done right, they should all be connected. And some brands, they don't have that many touch points. If it's a product focused brand, most of the work should be done on that product. That should set the tone. If it's a brand that leans heavily into marketing and advertising, like State Farm, for example, insurance companies. I did the sound logo for State Farm, and, insurance companies, everyone has a sound logo. They advertise all the time. So that's where they want to put their energy. That's really where they want to focus. Whereas Google, for example, or, Apple, they don't really have sound logos. They focus more on their product sounds. So ideally, if it's a brand that has all those touch points, it's a very connected system. Most brands, I would say, really have a particular area of focus where sound can play the biggest role.
We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. It's time for a coffee break with our friends over at Methodical Coffee. Hey, Will, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic.
Will Shurtz, co-founder of Methodical and master roaster. So everybody wants the best cup of coffee, especially in the middle of a busy workday. How should we think about coffee roasts and how to select the right flavor profile for us?
Yes. Classically, everybody is prone to thinking light, medium, or dark roast coffee. And I have been too. But over the past few years, I've kind of been on this journey of thinking about coffee more so as its flavor profile. And I want all coffee to have sweetness, whether it's roasted lightly or more dark. And so I think it's fun to be able to free your mind and experience the full spectrum of coffee. You get to your coffee break, and instead of saying, all right, do I want light roast coffee or a dark roast coffee? Maybe you could start saying, do I want to taste a coffee that has more fruit-forward, complex, esoteric characteristics? Or do I want to have something just an easy drinker, maybe a little bit more roasty, a little darker, a little bit more of like a toasted profile? And so there's this way to think about coffee now that I am constantly and currently going through this, where I'm starting to try to think about coffee as what is the more holistic flavor of the coffee. I used to tell myself I didn't like dark roast. And I think what I found out is it wasn't that I didn't like dark roast coffee. It's that I didn't like the lack of sweetness in a coffee that was roasted dark. So at Methodical, if you go to our website, we have the full spectrum of coffees from light, fruit forward to a little more traditionally dark roasted coffee. And we categorize them for ease of flavor profile. You'll see avant-garde, contemporary, and classic offerings. And so I don't mean to talk so much to make things more complicated. Really, I want to simplify things more and say, let's just kind of free ourselves up to think more holistically about coffee roast profiles.
I love that. And people can learn more about Methodical Coffee at methodicalcoffee.com. While you're there, you could check out the special Design Better roast. It's one of our favorites. That's methodicalcoffee.com. Learn more about Methodical Coffee and get some tips on how to brew the best cup of coffee at methodicalcoffee.com. Design Better is supported by our pals at LinkedIn. It's our favorite social network. It's hard to get your B2B marketing to land with the right audience because, let's face it, the web is a super noisy place. If your message isn't targeted to the right audience, it just disappears into that noise. But with LinkedIn ads, you can precisely reach the professionals who are more likely to find your ad relevant. With LinkedIn's targeting capabilities, you can reach people by job title, by industry, company, and a whole lot more. Through LinkedIn ads, you can start building relationships with 1 billion professionals, 180 million senior-level executives, and 10 million C-level executives. Plus, their measurement tools are built specifically for B2B. In tech, LinkedIn generates 2 to 5x higher return on ad spend than any other social media platform. And I can tell you, just speaking from personal experience here at Design Better and in previous roles in my career, LinkedIn definitely produces the best results for paid media. You can start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. To get a $100 credit on your next campaign, just go to linkedin.com/designbetter to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/designbetter. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be. See what I did there? Web designers, this one's for you. I've got 1 minute to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things that you can do from start to finish in 1 minute or less on Studio. You can adapt your designs for every device using responsive AI, reuse assets like templates, widgets, sections, and design libraries across sites and share them with your team. Switch up the styling of hundreds of web pages. That means fonts, layouts, colors, all in a click. Add no-code animations and gradient backgrounds right in the editor. Export your designs from Figma to Wix Studio in just a click. Oh, and one more big one. Package and deliver everything your client needs in one smooth handover. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Microsoft Azure. Turn your ideas into reality with an Azure free account. Get everything you need to develop apps across cloud and hybrid environments, scale workloads, create cloud-connected mobile experiences, and so much more. Discover what you can create with popular services free for 12 months. Learn more at azure.com. That's azure.com. And sign up for a free account to start building in the cloud today.
And now, back to the show.
You mentioned Apple, and although they may not have a logo, as you mentioned, there's some iconic sounds like the boot up sound on the Mac, and then Windows. I believe Brian Eno made their early Windows boot up track. I'm curious if you have, ran across any stories or found any inspiration from some of these kind of iconic sounds that many of us grew up with.
Totally. Yeah, the Eno sound is iconic. I mean, all of them, have their place, and they all have interesting stories. The Apple boot up sound, Jim Reeks kind of going in, because they had a prior sound to that was really kind of dissonant. and it drove him crazy. And he just went in to the code, this guy, Jim, and developed, I think it's just a C major 7 chord or something with like a very lush pad, but he just put it into the new OS and it launched. And here we are today, and it's quite an iconic sound. But you're right, those aren't traditional sound logos. They're not used at the end of advertisements, but they become synonymous with those brands. It is their sound. I think about it the same way, like a lot of clients come to me primarily for UX sound design, and they don't really have a need for a sound logo, but I say, hey, your product startup, that key moment, there's a key moment within every product experience or app experience. And that should be a very branded sound, because you may not be advertising today or tomorrow, but you might be in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And you can leverage that highly branded asset and that core brand moment across your advertising or your social channels to build kind of recall, which is really cool. I think about there's a ways to be flexible across these things, and utilize assets across different mediums that I think can be super powerful.
Can we go deeper into the key moment thing? I wrote a book called Designing for Emotion, which is about this intersection of psychology and design and how we can kind of engage emotion and make people feel connected and trust and so forth. And in that book, I talk a little bit about finding these key moments. I'm curious, as you're advising clients, how do you point to this is the key moment that you should really be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think typically we think about it on the spectrum of like brand sounds, hero sounds, system sounds, and more just very functional sounds. Functional and system sounds are just that. They're very functional. But those brand or hero sounds, brand sounds are typically more layered. They're in startup moments, booting up a computer or a product, or like in the automotive space, there's a lot of companies that are doing welcome sounds now. They might be outside of the car as you approach it and getting in. Traditionally, it's like when you turn your car on, you hear something, but that space is becoming much more immersive in particular. So like those are, to me, key moments, brand moments, the first experience moments. You know what I mean? That is something that I see as a brand moment. Hero moments are moments that might happen more frequently, or a special feature, for example, or a notification that is heard quite frequently, and it's a step down from brand sounds. It has some of the layers and it has that kind of cohesive melodic phrasing or key signature, but it's just a level down. But yeah, it's a collaborative process, I'd say. It's all about understanding the product experience and working with a client, the back and forth of what do you think is this moment. Sometimes it's very clear and very obvious, but sometimes not. Sometimes it might be a special feature that makes their product very unique, and we want to really tap into that to kind of shine a light on it.
Connor, I was reading an article that had a section that was profiling you, and we'll link in the show notes. It sounds like on some of these big projects, like you were hired by Amazon to create the Fire Phone sounds, and you might think, or at least I might, as somebody who's doesn't understand the workings behind all this, that, okay, you go off for like a month and you do this and it's done. But it said that you worked on it for like over a year and a half. And I'm sure you weren't working only on that, but I'm curious, as you're developing the sounds for a big project like that, what does it look like to get kind of buy-in across the parts of the organization that you need to, kind of get those sounds shipped essentially with the product? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's different for every company. Firephone in particular was fairly intense because it went all the way up, to the CEO level. But usually, we'll get up to VP of design level. In some companies, you're working with that person pretty consistently, so it doesn't take as long. But sometimes, you work on creative for 4 months and then you pitch through the levels and then you get up to that level and then you kind of got to go back down, right? So it really kind of depends on the company, I would say. And the projects are different, like the Amazon project was a year and a half. It was a very long process as far as the getting buy-in. But, more recently, I've been working with companies more as, and I see a lot of power in this, is working as an embedded team member, being really embedded into their Slack channels, being a part of their weekly stand-ups, to where it's more like micro check-ins that you can really move at a much faster clip and keep people as a part of the process, core people that are going to be key decision makers close to it, to where it really speeds things up. So that's kind of the power I see too. And like, my company is very small. It's me, and I hire people on a per project basis. And I see a lot of power in that because I can be super nimble and I can, as I mentioned, be an embedded team member. And that's honestly, that's so important, especially with UX projects, because it is highly iterative. Things are always changing. You got to do a lot of testing. So having that ability to be nimble and to be an extension of a team is, to me, just like super important for brands that are doing this work.
I'm curious about the process that's involved in this. Like if you're embedded and if it's iterative, presumably you're sharing different versions of the sounds that you're working on. But you also described with the Fire Phone, it went all the way to the top. So it sounds like maybe Jeff Bezos is listening to these and giving feedback directly. Is that right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So like it's not a visual thing. So how are you presenting it? You're not making a deck, presumably. How do you share this with people, whether it's a big presentation or it's just that iterative approach?
Yeah, again, it's kind of different per project and per client, but I'd say 95% of the time we're presenting in deck form. So we're developing presentations that have a visual component to it. A lot of the work we do is tied to motion, So having the ability to kind of showcase that in a deck format that has a little bit of copy on why we're making decisions. And it's something we can leave with clients to the end. Because it's, with these feedback rounds and the iterative process, people need time. I mean, some clients can make a decision in the room. I like them to take their time, because sometimes it just does take that time to get an understanding and to get used to new concepts and new ideas. So yeah, I mean, 90% of the time we're doing feedback rounds in PowerPoint or Keynote, walking, hand-holding clients through that process. But with that embedded team kind of style, there's also the ability to just pop sounds in Slack, be like, hey, what do you think about this? And that's a really nimble, quick way to work. I always leave it up to clients in terms of how they like to work, because doing it in the deck format, that is really helpful when you're going up the internal ladder, of a company, getting up to CEO or CMO. But if you're working with a UX team that's got 5 to 15 people, sometimes it's just easier to share in a more nimble way.
So a lot of apps use sound as a way to get your attention for notification, thinking of like Slack's kind of knock brush sound that you have a new message. And with Slack, at least you can change that default, but many apps, I'm sure the user doesn't have the option. So I'm just curious about how you think about maybe a notification sound, getting somebody's attention without becoming annoying over time.
Yeah, no, that's a great call. There's a personalization aspect that I'm a fan of. I'm not one to say, hey, we need to ship 50 options for people that are totally unrelated to one another. It's more about, let's set a cohesive kind of tonality that's reflective of brand, but let's give, a range of kind of buckets for users, people that are hard of hearing, right? They need a subset of louder sounds, that are in a particular frequency range that they can really hear. Whereas people who are really sensitive to sounds, neurodivergent users, for example, those sounds should be designed in the more mid-range and be softer. So I'm a big proponent for thinking about it through the lens of just range of users and accessibility, shipping sound sets, small sound sets, nothing too crazy, but that are specifically designed through the brand lens, but for a particular type of user. I think there's a lot of power in that. And it's a good look for companies to do that because it shows that they're considering their end users.
Do you get to do any user research with this? I think it's fascinating that you're thinking about neurodiversity and other just kind of elements of who's using this and how this sound will be perceived.
Yeah, we do a fair amount of user testing. Sometimes it's internal groups within the company. They have their own internal test groups. Sometimes we're using third-party partners for this. It really depends, and it's kind of more on the client side. Well, I should say more on the client side for internal test groups. And we help kind of building those studies with them. And then obviously taking that feedback, which is super valuable in terms of, are the sounds meeting the function they're intended to meet? But also like just creatively, because getting that third-party feedback from a different group that hasn't been in the design rounds for the last 2 months, getting fresh ears on it, that third-party feedback is super valuable. But yeah, ultimately it's outside third parties that we contract or internal kind of test groups within the company.
When you're in the sort of flaring portion of the design process and just trying to come up with ideas and things to prototype with. You mentioned, maybe going out in nature, but are there other things you do, play music or other kind of rituals you have when you're in sort of that, inspiration mode of the design process?
Yeah, I found like looking back at old work, past examples is really helpful to get inspiration. And sometimes you can just glean little nuggets, of, oh, that's a really cool patch I created. Let's recreate that, and let's pull that over here and make it something new. But I often look back to that type of work, past work, but also part of that upfront discovery process is really gleaning best practices from the competitive space or like aspirational brands and pulling from that material and saying, this is really cool what they're doing at company X. I really like how they're thinking about this melodically or tonally, and kind of gleaning, inspiration from those examples too. So sometimes it can be looking outside or even looking at music, and just honing in on really key phrases, like trying to isolate in your mind, like, oh, I really like that arpeggio, or I really like that guitar tone, or whatever it may be. And then kind of recreating that. So it's kind of all over, whether it be past work or new music you're listening to, or, inspiration from the competitive field.
Outside of your instruments, what's your toolkit, software, hardware, et cetera?
Yeah, so I've got some hardware synths, pretty minimal compared to many composers, but my digital setup, I use Ableton Live, I also use Logic, and then a bunch of third-party plugins. It's pretty fun because they're just constantly coming out with new kind of third-party plugins, whether it be effects or instruments. So those are kind of my primary like digital tools, especially as I've gotten older and been in the space for a long time, is coming back to real instrumentation, having the imperfections that exist on those real instruments. It's hard to replicate. So I find a lot of inspiration in that. And then recording that where I can keeps things fresh, I think.
You mentioned that you started your career, or maybe not even your career, but your interest in this space as a musician. Do you still find time to make music for fun?
Not as much as I would hope. Life is pretty hectic now. I got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. So unfortunately not as much, but I, once a week I'll try to get a couple hours into recording. It's funny though. I am playing more than I ever have. Got a new acoustic guitar and I've been playing on that a lot, and just getting back to that, like I was talking about with these acoustic instruments, like the imperfections there, the technical side of playing has been really great for me lately. My bread and butter, my kind of used to be more recording and production, and now it's kind of pivoting over to playing my acoustic guitar and like playing bluegrass music. I hadn't listened to bluegrass forever, and like getting back into that. And I've been taking lessons for that. I'm going to this academy for it over the summer. Going to be learning from like some of the best flat pickers in the world. It's cool. It's just like when you're so deep in a space, whatever design space or whatever world you're working in, I think it's important to kind of like try to pivot out of it a little bit. It just makes things so much more fresh when you come back to it.
I'm curious if you played around, the whole generative AI space is obviously huge in tech right now. And there's some really interesting tools. I mean, I'm not a musician. I played cello a little bit when I was younger, but there's this tool now called Suno.ai, and I was playing around with this weekend. And my daughter's 13. I was at her volleyball tournament, and these things last forever. It seems like 12 hours sitting there on bleachers. And so I was playing with this app, and I had it made a country song about a dad who's cheering on his daughter's volleyball game, but his butt's getting sore from sitting on the bleachers for 12 hours. And it came out. I mean, it was amazing what it came up with. And maybe we'll link to that in the show notes. But I'm just curious, like this new tool palette that AI is offering, have you experimented with at all with that, or where do you think it's going to take your industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I haven't explored as much on the music and sound side yet. But I was talking to a colleague recently, and he was just on a podcast talking about using Google's music AI tool and the results of that being, very AI, very robotic in a sense. But he found little nuggets within it that were really interesting and inspiring, and then essentially sampling that and bringing that and then creating around it. So the materials that I've heard out of music AI right now are just not quite there yet. Again, kind of going back to real instruments, it's like, having the human touch, having that imperfection is really what kind of makes music quite amazing. And I don't think AI is quite there yet, but I know it will get there. But right now, it's a tool that we can use to kind of get ahead, and you can speed up your process, or maybe use it to get sounds in front of clients at an earlier stage, right? To get feedback from. But right now, it's like I'm not using any music AI tools. I use a lot of other AI tools, for especially like writing briefs and things like that, or just getting ideas and inspiration from things like ChatGPT that I find really interesting. But yeah, I think to me, the human element is a big part of what I love about music. And I know it will, over the course of time, it will certainly take shape in AI to where it's more organic sounding and it has that level of imperfection. But I do think the more human component is something that I'm always looking for. They say if you're not using it, you'll be left behind, which is probably true. It's like you got to use it to a certain extent and use it to your advantage. So you got to start digging in more.
You mentioned at the top of the interview that you grew up listening to jazz, and that's been something that's kind of been a staple in your life. What do you think jazz and improvisation in particular could teach us about the creative process?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think it's just being open, being open to your experience in a given time, and also being present. Like that's the biggest part of improvisation, is being present with your instrument and present in the time and letting the music reflect that. So I think that is something that I always try to keep with me, is an open-mindedness too, because, in client work, in corporate work, things can get very narrow very fast, but like trying to keep the team open-minded to where something could go, having that fluidity, like, is a superpower. It's not always the right thing. Sometimes it just won't work in a client setting. But if you can kind of keep that open mind, I think you're going to be more willing to push the boundaries, I guess I could say. You're going to be more willing to push things to where they haven't gone before if you can operate with that kind of open mind.
I just recently saw Julian LJ. He's a guitarist.
Yeah.
And he's, if listeners, if you have not heard of Julian LJ, it's LAGE is his last name. Go look him up on Spotify. He's amazing. And what was fascinating to me is what you're describing, the discovering things and being open-minded. Watching him play, if you took a photograph of his face and cropped out everything else, and then you showed that to someone and said, "What is this man doing?" You'd say, well, he must have just opened a treasure box.
That's amazing.
And is marveling at what's in there, because he's playing and it's almost like he didn't know what was going to happen. It just sort of emerged. And that is like creativity and the creative process at its best. It's fascinating to see when someone is so fluid with their work and in a state of flow, what can happen.
Absolutely, man. And by the way, I love Julian LJ. He's very, very talented, really good stuff. I just got into him maybe in the last year. But yeah, I mean, that open-mindedness, the happy accidents, I think that is an interesting thing that I try to hold on to as well. I mean, the world that I live in, that I work in, strategy is a big part of what we do, and the reason that is there is to really get alignment and, get clients on board, get everyone on the same page. But I think we always have to be open to happy accidents. Getting too narrow of a strategic lens, I think, can be limiting sometimes, and that's where I think I'm kind of different than a lot of the agencies that do what I do. They're really, really narrowly focused on that. And that's great, but sometimes it can produce quite vanilla results. Being open-minded and having an open mind towards happy accidents can create something like we were just talking about that pushes the boundaries, and creates something really unique.
So Connor, what is inspiring you these days? And it doesn't have to be work-related. Could be a TV show you just got into, a book you just read, podcast you like.
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest things for me is being new out here in Colorado is having such close proximity to the mountains. I'm a big outdoors person, get out and hike into the backcountry as much as I can. Moments of peace when I go fly fishing, like that type of thing. It just lets my brain think, in different ways. Those are very inspiring. They've always been, that's always, being in the Bay Area, I was surfing all the time or going to Tahoe and stuff like that. Those are key inspiration moments for me. And then also, I've got 2 young kids. That's a huge point of inspiration for me, seeing them light up whenever they find something new or when they're working on their own little creative projects. Like I mentioned, I'm going to this music academy over the summer and taking my son, and it's 5 days of camping during this music academy. He's very musical. We just got him into drum lessons, but he doesn't really have an instrument yet. He just turned 7. But he's coming to this academy with me where it's pretty open book. They're just like, hey, we got all these instruments, gravitate towards whatever you like or what inspires you. So I'm really looking forward to that and just seeing, hopefully the light turns on, and I just want him to have a good time. But those two things in particular are like my key inspiration points. I mean, obviously music is a huge part of that. There's a band called Orion's Belt, really, really cool stuff. I think they're based in Sweden. I got into their music maybe a year ago, but they just have such a breadth of music they create. I mean, some of their stuff sounds like Alice Coltrane, really cool. Some of their stuff sounds like Khruangbin. I think everyone kind of sounds like Khruangbin after the last 3 years, but these guys do it really well. They just have a ton of breadth in their work that is great. And when you hear someone like doing Alice Coltrane or that style really, really well, in the modern day, that type of thing kind of piques my interest. So check those guys out. They're really cool. They've been a big inspiration for me.
That's great. I always love a good recommendation of something to listen to. Connor, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, I think the biggest part is just my website, seemoresound.com. So it's the letter C, MOORE, sound.com. I mean, that's the main place where, all the work is, and also some of the process and some thought pieces as well. Also, I have a LinkedIn profile for my business, See More Sound, and then an Instagram page as well. So those are kind of the 3 core areas.
Fantastic. Connor, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks, guys. It was a lot of fun.
This episode was produced by Eli Woolery and me, Aaron Walter, with engineering and production support from Brian Paik of Pacific Audio. If you found this episode useful, we hope that you'll leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to finer shows. Or simply drop a link to the show in your team's Slack channel, designbetterpodcast.com. It'll really help others discover the show. Until next time.